the corrective action and the learning was, okay, we made this checklist so burdensome and complicated and irritating, and it didn't make their job easier. Everybody was bypassing it. The takeaway management should have when they see people doing that is not necessarily, hey, lazy operator, and let's slap them on the hand. It's probably, let's look at our process and see why it is such a pain in the butt.
Hear you on 8. You on 8. Okay, you're clear. Stand by for your base.
Our helicopter landed in a farm field. My partner and I stepped into the back of an ambulance. Local EMS had a small child in status seizure. We made the decision to intubate the patient. Arguably, this is one of the hardest things we will do in helicopter EMS. Perform a drug-assisted airway. Many things need to happen in sequence without mistake. My partner worked on optimizing the patient while I prepared our equipment for the procedure. And then finally, it reached a point where I felt like everything was ready, but I wasn't sure. I needed a tool to help confirm that I had prepared myself for success. I needed to know that I was doing all the appropriate steps before we did this critical process. I needed to know our meds were drawn up, our equipment was correct, but I didn't have this. Well, sort of. I had a checklist. I wore it around my neck, but I didn't refer to it. Why? Well, frankly, it was too complicated. It was supposed to reduce cognitive burden, but it increased it. It was a synthesis of our protocol containing many points. Some of these things I had done and some of these things I had not done. I felt like I would just wing it. After I wondered about this for a second, I thought, is this the point of a checklist? Well, my research in this subject would tell me no, but I had no better alternative. I've been told these tools are supposed to reduce error and make life better, but all they seem to do is get in the way. It's a card with small font, front and back, but it feels like too much. There's got to be a way to make this better. Well, that is the impetus for our episode today. Our guest today is Glenn Fisher. Glenn ultimately is a pilot. He flies for one of the major airlines, but he's more than that. In that major airline, which I promise if I told you the name of it, you would recognize it, he is also on the safety committee. Now, his role is more than I understand. I'm going to let him explain it. But ultimately, he has split duty. Some of the time he flies, and some of the time he weighs in on safety issues and incidents that arise. So first off, Glenn, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, man. For anyone that's maybe didn't hear our other episode, which if you haven't, you should go listen to it. Glenn and I talk about crew resource management and communication under critical incidents. But Glenn, describe for me like a normal 6-month rotation in your job.
So my schedule usually would be 2 months of flying. So I would do a normal flying schedule. I fly internationally generally. So I'm doing 3-day trips most often internationally on a wide body airplane. And then every third month, I'll do a full month of my safety job. And that job's called, I'm an ASAP, Aviation Safety Action Program is the acronym. ASAP ERC, Event Review Committee representative. So I'm an ASAP ERC representative for our company. And this is a program you'll find at a lot of different airlines in the US. It's recognized by the FAA. So there's similar people doing similar jobs at almost every major airline for the ASAP program.
And why split? Why not just become an ASAP full-time?
So they require at my airline, and I think almost every airline would be similar, they require you to be a line pilot because you're going to be reviewing the mistakes and bad days of pilots, and you're reviewing their reporting, their self-reporting. So people will write up what they did wrong and all of their lessons learned, and they don't want somebody sitting sort of in judgment, if you will, in a way, although that's really not our job, but they don't want somebody who doesn't do the job sitting and reviewing these things. And so that we have the perspective of a line pilot in the culture at the time when we review these reports.
Walk me through an incident. So I'm working on the flight deck of a large aircraft, and I'm going to try to use your vernacular, but like me and the first officer or whomever have some sort of incident. What might be a typical incident? And then what's like the the progression that it goes through, and how does it come in front of you?
We see this often would be a misset altimeter. So our altimeters have a knob, and you set them based on the barometric pressure wherever you are. And if you don't set those correctly, it causes a difference between where you think you are in terms of altitude and where you actually are. And that can obviously cause problems with airplanes being separated from each other. So that is a pretty run-of-the-mill common error. It can happen a number of different ways, and it can be either very consequential. I mean, historically, it's led to accidents, or it can just be very benign, just sort of depending on the setup. But that's something that happens often. If a crew were to misset an altimeter and possibly get called out by air traffic control, or maybe they detect it themselves and air traffic control doesn't even notice, we would call that sole source. They would hopefully write up an ASAP report. So they'd say, hey, we made a mistake to each other. Let's fill out an ASAP when we land. So then they land. It used to be that we required them to fill out the ASAPs within a certain amount of time of landing. Now we just say timely. So at some point after they land, they write up a report, and they're supposed to sort of introspect, talk about what they did, why they think they did what they did, what lessons they can learn, what lessons the airline can learn. And as long as they fill out a really thorough introspective report, that will protect them from repercussions professionally. So they fill out that report, it gets put into our system. It goes through a program called triage. So we've got several very smart people that sit and they read all these reports. And if there's something really interesting where we might want some more information before the report goes in front of the committee that I'm on, the triage specialist will try to get that information for us. So then if that were to happen, say on a Monday, it'll go into the system probably the next week, the next Friday, and then it'll get sent out to all of the representatives. So there's 3 representatives on the committee, on every committee each week. There's a company representative, that's what I do. There's a union representative, and then there's the FAA. So there's the 3 of us sitting in the room reviewing all of the reports, and then there's one facilitator who's supposed to help move the meeting along. And also importantly, all of these reports are de-identified. We can't see the names on any of them. The only person that can see the names on the reports is the facilitator. And that firewall is very, very thorough, and everybody respects it. So truly, I can't see who did what. So then that all gets sent out to us on a Friday. We have until Wednesday to review everything and ask further questions if we need any information from other parties at the airline. And then on Thursday, we have a meeting, Thursday morning, where we review all of the reports with each other in a room and decide what we're going to do with them. So each of us comes into that room with an idea for every report, what we might want, but we also probably have a range of what we think is acceptable. So I would think, okay, I really want to send this crew for a human factors debrief because I think it's really interesting, but I might make notes in my spreadsheet that say I'm willing to go as high as an in-person debrief, which would be pretty significant for us, and I'm willing to go as low as a custom email. And that, I'm just making that up, but sometimes you go in and you're just like, I really want an in-person debrief. This is too significant. And usually we're all on the same page when things are that significant. And then you hash it out with the other 3 people in the room and come to an agreement. And we might review, when we review that altimeter, missetting report on a Thursday, we're probably going over that and maybe 200 to 300 other reports, which might represent 150 or 200 specific events. Obviously, because sometimes you have multiple parties reporting for certain events, right?
I think this is fascinating in several ways. So first off, for the listener, your brother, Ben, who's been on the show, is a paramedic, and Ben and I worked together, which is how I first met you. But the parallels between aviation and EMS, to me, are fascinating, right? In aviation, you have generally 2 professionals working together in an environment that requires both of them. It has a lot of risk, that has high consequences, and it can have a high cognitive load. Now, the same exists in EMS. We have a partner. We have 2 people, sometimes 2 paramedics, sometimes a paramedic and EMT. We're working together in an environment where we must work together, and there is risk, despite our dark humor and the things that we do to downplay some of this stuff. There are consequences. Sometimes another human being's life can be in play. And so the thing that's fascinating to me is that aviation, because those consequences are high, has done significant work to come up with processes to promote a culture of safety and of learning and to try to improve themselves. And I think that many of those lessons can be learned in EMS. So that's one of the reasons why I think speaking with you is so fascinating. I want to specifically hone in on the concept of checklists. You know, I've been given a couple of checklists in my job, but I first became more interested in checklists after reading the book, The Checklist Manifesto by Dr. Atul Gawande, who is a surgeon. And if you're unfamiliar, I encourage you to read it. But he discusses the intersection of checklists and medicine and cognitive aids. But I guess backing up a little bit, checklists essentially came from aviation, this concept of a checklist. And though I know you're not a historian, it'd be interesting if you could give us just like a super down and dirty, brief overview of checklists.
Yeah, and I was just trying to research a little bit of some of that for this podcast, and I didn't realize this because I read Atul Gawande's book as well. And kind of the common folklore among pilots is, if you were to ask a lot of different pilots, I think they would give the same answer he did, which is the checklist really started with a World War II airplane crash in flight testing back in the 30s. But I was just Googling it real quick earlier, and apparently that the name, the word, and the idea has been around quite a bit before then. So it's interesting. I didn't know that. I always thought that the whole concept sort of started with more complicated airplanes, but certainly I think that's when it really became popularized. And as I think aviation got more and more complicated, I think we've really refined it a lot. But I know there's other industries as well that have. So I'm sure deep sea divers and any sort of complicated engineering projects would be really checklist intensive. And I know now medicine is using them quite a bit. But as airplanes got more complicated and you couldn't really memorize all of the processes, checklists became more and more important. The common story is that crash of I think it was a B-29, I believe, or B-17 actually.
In a nutshell, like, correct me if I'm wrong, flying an airplane kind of went from sort of like driving a car, like one engine, some stuff to do, to like these World War II era bombers have 4 engines, multiple systems, hydraulic systems, navigation systems. There's just too many things to remember.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's accurate. And I mean, even my guess is that pilots before that incident were probably using something similar to what some general aviation pilots would use today, which would be some sort of mnemonic or something that they might say to themselves before landing. And it might be four items or 5 items, and maybe they have a catchy way to remember it. But it's the really important, critical stuff. But like you were saying, before the really big bombers and really complicated airplanes came along, those items might be as simple as, a couple engine controls and making sure your landing gear was down. And then as planes got more complicated, the things that you needed to remember got more and more complicated. We may talk about this later, but, you get into systems that are so complicated that when they behave abnormally, it's definitely nothing you would have memorized. You need to start pulling out a book and going through a procedure and using a checklist in that case.
Yeah, so fast forward, like, let's say you and I were working together on a modern flight deck tomorrow. Like, what would be an example of just that scenario? Like, how would we utilize checklists?
As we start to prepare the airplane for a flight, we're going to use checklists that are, in many cases, going to be truly just for checking items that we've already done. So we'll have what's called a flow, and we'll study flows when we go through pilot training using paper representations of cockpits. So we'll just memorize a series of buttons and switches and what the appropriate position is. And we'll sit there with our paper copies of the cockpit and we'll memorize the entire flow, and we'll know what everything needs to do and what position it needs to be in. And then once that's complete, the 2 pilots will say, okay, we'll have a trigger for, say, pushing back the airplane. Okay, well, we know that each of us should have completed our flows and that all the switches for this part of the process should be everything should be done, but now we're going to use a checklist to make sure it's done. So that would be an example of one of our normal checklists. Sometimes that'll be done together. So each pilot, one person will read the checklist, and then both people may check their respective items. Or sometimes it'll be one person will read the checklist and the other person will check all of the items on the checklist. There's other times where if one person's occupied, for example, after landing, the captain's generally taxiing the airplane, then just the co-pilot's going to read the checklist after having done the checklist. But once again, that's still a checklist that's checking things that have already been done. So after landing, I have a flow of things I'm going to accomplish, and then I'm going to reference a checklist when the captain calls for it. He's going to tell me to do the after landing checklist, and I'll just go through and make sure that all those items were actually completed.
It's kind of like getting your kids ready for school, maybe. Like, did they brush their teeth? Did they put their shoes on? Did you pack your lunch?
They're not going to, and I mean, my kids, so I'm a dork and I'm an aviation dork. And so my kids actually have checklists for a lot of these things. And yeah, it is, in that case, it is something that they're checking. They're not doing what we would call read and do. They're going down a list and verifying they've already done all the things that they're expected to do. And that was a flow or a memorized list or just a habit pattern that they should have already executed. And now they're just verifying with the checklist that they did all those things. And that's one way to use it. Another way would be to actually read and do from a list. So that would be something that's maybe a little more abnormal. I can't show anything from my current company. Obviously, it's all proprietary, but this company no longer exists, but I used to fly for them, so I think I can show all this stuff. So this is not a normal checklist. This is an abnormal. This is all of our abnormal procedures. So this is the sort of thing you'd pull out when things are not going correctly, and this is much more extensive. This is stuff that you would do it as you read it. So you would read the statement and then you would move the switch to the correct position, because this represents so many different possible failure modes that you could never memorize all of these things. Now, there are some procedures in here that do require some memorization, but most of them do not.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, one of the big differences is the first checklist you described was a flow, and that's kind of like, hey, these things are done every single time. We're used to it. We're probably able to do it without it, but we're gonna make sure anyway, because if we miss something, it's a big deal. And then what you just held up and described is like, this is a situation we do not find ourselves in frequently. Correct. So what's the expectation on the pilot if it's a situation you don't find yourself in frequently, but you still kind of know what needs to happen?
Yeah, so that's actually, I got a name. Those are called memory items by most civilian pilots. I think the military pilots have their own terminology for that. So here would be an example of that. So for a rapid cabin depressurization, we would have two memory items. Back when I was at this airline, it's pretty simple. Some of our other memory items are more extensive. Anything in the box there is expected to be completed from memory before you reference this book here. So as soon as we recognize that we have a rapid cabin depressurization, we should recognize it based on the following things: a voice message of cabin and the following messages on our computer in the front. Then we should don our oxygen masks and establish crew communications. Only once we've done our memory items should we pull this book out and start reading and doing the rest of the procedure. Only certain things have memory items, and that's like a big, complicated discussion among all the people, all the stakeholders who get to make these decisions of like what actually warrants memorization, and then which procedures do we need to have some memorization for, and then what specifically should be memorized, and then what do we leave to doing as we read in the book.
I mean, so an aircraft becoming depressurized seems like a big deal. Why not require pilots to memorize all of the steps?
You would want somebody to memorize something if it's time critical. Some of the steps are time critical. They need to do them before they would have a chance to read this in order to protect the plane, and the passengers. But the following steps after you do what's memorized may be so extensive or complicated. You don't want people doing that from memory, because mistakes could be possibly worse than the problem that you've got, which we see frequently in flight training in the simulator. All the time, people will possibly read these incorrectly and then create bigger problems for themselves. So it's something we practice a lot, is how to use this book properly so that we don't cause bigger problems. But for example, on this plane, I don't have it bookmarked, but there was a procedure for if we had a runaway of the aileron system. So if the plane's starting to roll upside down because of the failure of one of the flight control systems, there were two buttons that we should push to disable that system on our overhead. And that was the memory item, to disable those two systems with those two buttons. After that, you really wouldn't want anybody doing anything from memory. It's going to be too complicated. And if you screw it up, all of a sudden things could get worse.
See, that's interesting because that's kind of foreign in our world, because in EMS, we have not, most places have not readily adopted this. So you are expected to just white knuckle memorize things, but you do encounter error. And then when you encounter error, you encounter shaming, basically. Of like, oh, you couldn't perform or you couldn't do it.
I think aviation probably has come a long way in terms of our processes and our culture. And I think there's different groups in the medical world, from talking to my brother and from you, that may have come further or maybe not as far. If you were to go back in time, I think the amount that would be expected to be memorized was probably quite a bit more than what is now. And I think some of that is just sort of institutional learning about what is good to have people doing from memory, and then maybe where bad mistakes happen, and where we really want them referencing the book. Nowadays, I bet if you could find the hard cards where we have all of the things that we want memorized, and maybe show those over the last 50, 60 years, they've probably gotten quite a bit smaller. Now, some of that's also the technology of the airplanes has taken some of that away from us, so that we don't have quite as big of a load of things to memorize.
That's, I guess, thinking about speaking with you, that's where I care the most, is like, that's where our cognitive load is the highest, and we have the least margin to stop and regroup, so to speak. That's where I think checklists in EMS most commonly get talked about and applied. The most obvious example in EMS is doing airway management. So, for example, like putting a breathing tube in somebody. If you mess that up, you can kill them. You need multiple pieces of equipment, and multiple things need to happen in sequence. And so a lot of institutions try to implement a checklist for that procedure, some better than others. And some basically take somewhere on paper, there is a protocol for that procedure, which will be at least one page, usually more than one page. And so some places will synthesize that entire protocol into like a small card, but it ends up being too busy, kind of like my story at the start of this. It's too many items. It ends up becoming more of a cognitive burden than a helpful tool. So people just don't use it. I'm curious, like, what does that resonate at all? Like, are checklists ever ignored, or in your world, do people ever say like, there's just too much on this, I'm not going to do it?
100%. I mean, absolutely. Historically, that's been a problem, and it's been something that has slowly probably gotten better over time, but absolutely. There are accidents you could go back and look at where pilots were doing what was sort of the common sort of tribal knowledge practice on the line, which was not at all what the management wanted to happen in terms of checklists. And there's accidents where, when they went back and looked at that, the corrective action and the learning was, okay, we made this checklist so burdensome and complicated and irritating, and it didn't make their job easier. Everybody was bypassing it. And so, maybe that was causal to the accident, or maybe it was just that if there was an accident, you were going to find the fact that people weren't using that checklist, because a large portion of people were not using it. So I think that's historically been something that is true. I would say now at the airline I'm at, that's very rare. In the safety program that I'm in, you do find people sometimes taking shortcuts, but it's pretty rare. Everybody is pretty disciplined when it comes to checklists, because I think over time we've learned our lesson in the industry. But usually that's a sign, it's easy to start going down the road of like, oh, a lazy operator. And that's where I think that book, Just Culture, is a really great book. The takeaway management should have when they see people doing that is not necessarily, hey, lazy operator, and let's slap them on the hand. It's probably, let's look at our process and see why it is such a pain in the butt. An EMT or pilot didn't come to work to hurt passengers or to kill a patient. Like, they came to do a very important job. And if they're bypassing sort of the process, part of the process, probably the process needs improvement.
Tell me more a little bit about so you've described the different kinds of checklists, but when you're a pilot on the flight deck, where are these checklists coming from? How do they get there? And then how do they change?
It's a big process that involves a lot of people, even some people outside of the airline. So the FAA is going to have to sign off on any of our checklists when we change them. And then the abnormal checklists, not only is the FAA and the company going to have to sign off on, but like this one, for example, is for an Embraer. So the manufacturer is going to be involved in a lot of this checklist creation. So a lot of different people are involved in the checklist creation. As far as how they kind of evolve, it's a constant process. Once they're created, we'll use our safety data to look at, are they working? And if they aren't working, we'll tweak them. But even tweaks to our normal checklists, it's a big deal to change our normal checklist. So you're talking about not a quick, oh, hey, look, we saw a couple ASAPs that involve a problem here. Let's rewrite this checklist. At a big airline, you're talking about many, many months. Many people are going to put eyes on that and make sure that there's not some unintended consequence to a checklist change. And the FAA is going to have to sign off on it too. So it's a constant evolution, though, and it's probably similar in your industry, but you got change bars on these things. So anytime something changes, you can see what changed, and we get notices anytime there's changes, so we can read up on that. But at my current airline, there's been a couple process improvements that I can think of over the last couple of years that maybe took 6 or 9 months, where we were looking at data saying, okay, there are, let's say there's airplanes taxiing out with their flaps up at too high of a rate. We were saying at one point, we can detect that either through my ASAP program or also through our the flight data recorders that we download periodically of the airplanes. We can see when planes taxi with their flaps up, and that's a precursor to attempting a takeoff with the flaps up, which historically has caused airplane accidents. So we changed a bunch of processes, changed some of the flows, changed some of the checklists, and then we were actually able to measure a huge decrease in the frequency of those taxi out, flap up events.
That 6 to 9 months actually sounds pretty quick, to be honest.
Yeah, I guess it probably depends on how you measure that, because that problem that existed for a long time. I don't know, how long people have been thinking about trying to fix it, but even just getting an approval, if somebody has an idea, hey, I think it'd be really good if we did this, just getting that done may take a while. But in this industry, it's so safe. Everything is so refined at this point. You do not want to move fast and break things, because you can make things a lot worse. So you really want to make sure that the change you're going to make is going to be a good change before you just do something, because it might create all kinds of problems you didn't think about.
Do you think the average line level pilot appreciates that?
Yeah, I think so. When I think to some of the problems we've solved, I think sometimes those solutions come from those line pilots, really.
Yeah, I mean, farming good ideas from the line level people doing the work every day, I think, is generally the right way to find your good idea. So when I describe this idea or this concept of, in EMS, sometimes people take a protocol, which is kind of like I don't know an analogy to aviation, but it's like every aspect of this thing that we can do is put on paper so that it's on paper somewhere. If they just synthesize that into a checklist, it ends up being too much.
Yeah.
So like what's your reaction to that? Like, what do you think about that, and what kinds of things should be on a checklist?
Yeah, 100%. So, I mean, we have a variety of manuals at my airline, and every airline is going to have similarly named manuals. But for example, we have a flight operations manual, and we have a manual that's kind of our training manual, and it's going to be, as you were describing, just all of the details. So if you want to talk about getting an airplane off the gate, it's going to have every step, everything you need to do spelled out, and you're talking about dozens or maybe hundreds of pages in some cases for some of these things of just every step of the process. And there's no way anybody's going to really reference that in real time unless they had a very specific question and they had the time to answer it. So that's going to be something you study ahead of time. And then out of that, you're going to come up with the checklist. So to get a plane off the gate, you've got all of these steps, which we turn into our flows and all of these other things. And then the checklist really needs to be super, super culled down to this, just the really important meat of what is going to be super consequential if it doesn't happen. And so what's likely to be missed, and also what would be consequential if it's missed. You know, as you were describing before, if you make this thing too burdensome, people are going to bypass it and then it doesn't serve its purpose. So if you were to look at all the things we need to do to get a plane off the gate, you're talking about pages and pages and pages of procedures, which we learn how to do just by habit and memory and flows. And then if you were to look at the checklist to get off the gate, you're talking about maybe a 20-item checklist that is all of the things that if we didn't do them, they're going to cause significant problems later, or harm or damage to equipment or injury to people. So it's the really important stuff that you could forget is what ends up in the checklist. Now that's, I guess, different though than the abnormal read and do checklist, right? That's going to be everything you need to do is in the read and do checklist, but that's a different sort of situation that you haven't prepared for specifically.
What might be a time when a pilot would be expected to follow a checklist and they just don't do it?
Well, I guess there's the times when they don't do it and they should, and there's the times when they don't do it and they did the right thing by not doing it. So I guess there's two different.
Is that part of your job to determine that? Like an event bubbles up to the ASAP level and the checklist was not followed. Is that part of what you guys determine? Like, yeah, that seems actually reasonable, or they absolutely should have followed it?
Most of the time when people don't do a checklist, they probably should have. But there are situations where stuff happens that is a little bit outside the checklist, and they made the right call by not exactly following it. And that's something that's written into all the regulations. You know, a pilot in command or a captain can decide that the safest course of action is outside of the procedures and checklists and everything that they're normally supposed to do. And that's something that they can use that card if they need to. And sometimes it's the right thing to do. But we do see sometimes people not doing checklists, and they should, and that can cause anything from little minor issues to air disasters. So some of the events that have been big crashes because planes took off with their flaps not set were situations where people were bypassing procedures or pulling circuit breakers and then not detecting things on checklists that they should have. So either they didn't run the checklist, or they didn't have good checklist discipline, or, you know, we can also talk about some of the human factors of sometimes you can have every good intention and say the thing on the checklist and look at the thing, and then your brain just doesn't process that it's not in the right position. So it can be any of those failure modes. But
yeah, what are some of those? That's fascinating. So tell me more about that. So like, you can be intending to do the right thing, say you're doing the right thing, and just not do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think every human's probably experienced that somewhere in their life where they just, you know, maybe you call it a brain fart or something. You look at something and you just don't fully process what you're looking at. So if you are driving along and you blow through a red light and, you know, photons of light entered your eyeball that were, you know, red, and your brain just didn't process that fully and you didn't see it. In a similar way, you could be going down your checklist and having the discipline to actually look at or point or touch, and then that item is out of place and you just didn't detect it. So that can certainly happen. Or it could be a problem where you're reading the checklist and you're not having the discipline to look at each item and check and verify. So there's different ways that can fail. And certainly we see in the safety reporting all different kinds of ways where checklists were run, but things were not detected. And I've also heard that sometimes used as a reason why checklists aren't that great. I've actually specifically heard that from a friend of mine who was an ER doctor. It's like the people who would say, I know such and such dude who was in a car crash and a seatbelt killed him because he was trapped in a fire. I mean, sure, like that can happen, but far and away more often checklists are going to, you know, help prevent problems, and very rarely would they cause them. So, but yeah, as far as ways checklists can fail, there's a lot. And that gets into some really interesting human factor stuff, is like, you know, how our brains can fail us and what happens when we're tired and fatigued and maybe we're micro sleeping while we are reading and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, to your point about your friend or whomever that's an ER doctor, I mean, some EMS providers, when faced with checklists, common responses, well, I have all that memorized. I don't need that. You kind of talked about times where pilots have things memorized, but I don't know. What's your reaction to this mentality?
there are situations in aviation where you do want to have things memorized. You do want to do things as a flow, but you still are going to need to verify the really important things are done, because as we were just describing, brains are very fallible, and you can make errors or omissions. And I'm sure most people who've been in medicine a long time have seen things happen, just like pilots have. I have a very vivid memory of being in the back seat of a twin engine airplane during flight training. I was a flight instructor. I was with a flight instructor, and then there was a student in the front seat, and I watched them fly an entire approach all the way down to very uncomfortably close to the ground with their gear up, and they just never noticed it, and through a lack of checklist discipline and looking at something but not fully processing it and all these things. So, they had hundreds of flights. This person had probably still at that point where they had the process memorized, and they had, they would say, why do I need to do this? I know I need to put the gear down each time before I land, but then they didn't, right? And I think people who, maybe it's hubris or maybe they just don't have the experience to have been around long enough to watch themselves make a really ridiculous error. And then all of a sudden you think, okay, well, if I can do that when I had every intention of trying to do this correctly, then maybe a checklist is a good idea.
Man, that's like, you're hitting on something really profound actually in my industry, which is this idea of like watching yourself fail and being self-reflective enough to then say, I need to do this better, make a change. I think shame often prevails in our industry of like, ooh, I really hope nobody saw that. Otherwise it's gonna make people think I'm less competent. And our competence gets tied to our ability to just execute things automatically or from memory, which is unrealistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. And I think maybe that comes with the maturity of having done something for a really long time and having made mistakes. But it would be really good if we could try and make sure that newbies to the industry don't need to make those catastrophic mistakes to have that level of self-awareness and modesty, maybe. I don't know. I remember, it's a little bit tangential, but my mom had a teapot melt, I think, that she left on, and she kept it as a memento to remind her to be disciplined and diligent when leaving the house, of, like, make sure these things are unplugged. And similarly, I have a memento from a glider flight where I took off and I pointed it and read on a checklist. I looked at it, I pointed it. Part of my process was to touch it. And I did all these things to make sure my canopy was latched, and I had the latch in a abnormal position. It was forward instead of aft. And if you did it just right, you could wiggle it forward and it would test as if it was locked, but it was not truly locked. And then I lost that canopy. So that fortunately only cost me $1,500 instead of a whole airplane or, killing myself or the tow pilot. But it was very, very humbling experience to have had every intention of doing that correctly and then have this really bad outcome happen when I didn't do it correctly. So I kept myself a little piece of the canopy as a reminder that I can screw things up badly.
Yeah, I guess in the commercial industry, what's kind of the attitude towards something like that? Do people get to reflect on that and say, I really learned something here, I'm going to be better moving forward? Or do they get fired for their error?
Yeah, I guess we talked a little bit about that in the previous episode, but I think most modern good safety culture, Western airlines, we really have fully adopted this idea that you improve the process rather than just punishing the pilot. Everybody's trying to do a good job. Nobody's trying to hurt passengers or break anything. So I think for the most part, you have to do something. It's not something really bad. It's not that you have to do something really bad or you have to break something really expensive or hurt something. You have to do something very intentionally wrong to get in trouble in the sense that we used to think of probably in our industry, and maybe you guys do still a little bit. Otherwise, you're just going to get possibly some additional training. You're going to get to reflect on it with a human factors debriefer. But other than that, we really try to work on improving the process and understanding that the pilot didn't intend to do something wrong. And I think if you were to ask the average airline pilot stuff on this topic, you would find them to be there would be very little hubris, very humble in the sense that everybody's going to recognize they can make a catastrophic error given the right circumstances, because we've all made significant errors. And maybe that's a benefit of the ASAP program, is that we're always sitting around sort of analyzing and self-reflecting on the errors we make, so everybody sort of realizes that anybody could make them.
Yeah, that's great. So we've kind of talked a little bit about the different types of checklists. What sets a good checklist apart from the one I described that's just a protocol synthesized to one piece of paper?
You know, you showed me an example previously of maybe a not so great medical checklist. You can read up on, there's a NASA document, Human Factors of Flight Deck Checklists, the normal checklist, and then there's another one, and it goes really deep in the weeds on stuff is sort of seemingly silly and esoteric, is like what font to use. Should you make things capitalized or not? Should you make them bold or not? So it gets really, really deep into like just even the visual human factors of the checklist. The one you showed me was really a mess in that department. But then you also need to talk about what needs to be on there and what doesn't. Because if it's just a massive list of everything you need to do, it's going to slow you down. You're not going to read it all. That'd be quite silly. So it's really got to be culled to what's super, super critical. What could you forget? And if you did forget it, what would be really bad if you forgot? Some of the checklists I've seen from the medical world are really more like you were saying, just a list of things that you would do every time you did that. And in that case, I sort of wonder, either the people in charge who are making those misunderstand the purpose of a checklist, or they may be sort of using this with the understanding that nobody's going to use this thing, but it's maybe they're thinking it's like a liability sponge. Like, I've given you this piece of paper that tells you everything you need to do, so that when you screw it up, I can say, hey, item 56 of 100 was this thing you forgot. You should have done that. And I don't know that that's what's happening, but
I think it's definitely happening some places.
Yeah. They really need to be concise and well thought out, and just the layout of them, because people are going to, I mean, in both of our industries, people are going to be using these, you know, in some cases under duress. Like, it needs to be readable in low light, right? That's one thing that's kind of important. So, some of our checklists even change font and font size when it's something we would be reading with smoke goggles on. So you know, you're talking about like maybe being on a scene in nighttime with a helicopter blowing stuff around next to you and everything. Like, it's got to be really thought out how you're going to use the paper from a human factors perspective. And that NASA document's a good reference for that.
So the NASA has this great document about the production of a good checklist. Is that available online, and what would somebody search for to find it?
So there's Human Factors of Flight Deck Checklists, and then a NASA document, Cockpit Checklists, Concepts, Design, and Use. And then another one that might be applicable to the medical, certainly like EMS, like we were saying, is sort of more of our abnormal checklist. Design Guidance for Emergency and Abnormal Checklists. Those are all NASA documents, and they go really deep in the weeds on font size and font style and colors and everything like that, even what should be capitalized, what shouldn't. The other thing, though, that maybe you are dealing with that's different in your world is time criticality. Like, in aviation, even if your plane's on fire, we don't want people rushing, because really, when it comes down to it, it's not that time critical. Like, it is, but it isn't. So when you look at how long these planes were designed to survive if an engine's on fire, you got a while. And so we see bigger problems happen when pilots start really, really rushing. And we want them to slow down, even if something's on fire. Don't go crazy and be a hero doing all the things you've memorized and then make new problems, because you can find more than a couple accidents that have happened where an engine failed or an engine was on fire and a rushing pilot shut down the good engine doing their memor items for their engine problem because they weren't taking their time and being methodical. But I don't know. I mean, in your case, when you're intubating a patient, how long do you have? I mean, is it seconds? Is it less than a minute? Maybe you have more time criticality than we do.
So I would actually describe it similarly. Like, it's very rarely down to the second. If it's down to the second, you've potentially done some other things improperly, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not always. That rare case does exist, but it is possible. Usually, the most likely situation is I can do some other temporizing measures to optimize this situation while I gather my equipment and run through my process, so that when it actually comes time to execute this skill, I have everything prepared. So like I would prefer to slow down, but there is the problems are usually multifactorial. So let's say you're intubating a trauma patient. So let's say a patient has multiple gunshot wounds and they are really sick and they need to be intubated. You may want the airway problem may be able to wait while you run through your checklist, but the other problems that were created by the multiple gunshot wounds, like they're bleeding, those problems can't wait. And I guess we have processes that we go through to try to address that. For example, like we should manage external hemorrhage quickly, but if the patient's bleeding into their abdomen, so for example, I could execute our process flawlessly to establish an intubation, and it takes 15, 20 minutes, but that's critical time that they're now bleeding into their abdomen, that they need to be in front of a surgeon. So that's tricky because you're weighing, I think a good paramedic is weighing some of the cost benefit in these situations. At the end of the day, and this is probably similar to your world, something just takes the amount of time that it takes, like I can't, if I really, really start rushing and pushing myself, I'm going to make errors. And so, building in the maximum amount of efficiency I can. So like, for example, if I know I'm going to need this piece of equipment in a time sensitive manner and I store it somewhere where I have to get up and like walk to go get it. That's an extreme example, but like that's wasted time. That's inefficient. If I put all of the things needed in the time critical situation together, well, that saves time. So some of these system design things really become, huge pieces because they all add up. Because on the patient I described, let's say there's a patient with multiple gunshot wounds and they need me to establish an airway. Well, that's one multiple step process. Then they also need me to administer blood to them. Well, that's another multiple step process. And then I need to, there's like a handful of these processes that have multiple steps. And all of a sudden, if I'm too methodical, which is possible, then now I've just taken a ridiculous amount of time to perform these tasks, which is actually not in the patient's best interest.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? And would that be at all applicable to your world?
Yeah, no, I mean, so, I'll answer that and then I'm going to go back to something too. But yeah, I mean, there are situations where we want people to just execute the common sense best thing that they need to do right now. Sometimes it's said kind of flippantly as this airplane, that runway, like stop running checklists and doing all of these shenanigans because this plane needs to get on that runway, do pilot stuff, like 1-800 be a pilot, get it on there, get it on the ground, right? So that definitely happens. It's really rare. I think, and so going back a little bit, I think that's one of the big differences between our industries, not to trash talk my profession, but like it's very linear. It's very binary in many cases. I mean, there's a reason like basically engineers went through for this type of airplane and did a failure modes and effects analysis on everything that could break and what you needed to do if it did. And this is the size of book that resulted, right? It's not that big. A human body is really complicated. And then the other thing that we don't practice in the simulator, and you can certainly find good examples of it and good pilots will handle it very well, but we don't really anticipate in our training programs prepping pilots for specific situations where there are multiple like compounding failures that I think you probably on a normal day would see sort of things like that, the way you were describing the multiple gunshot wounds and having to triage different problems for the most important one right now. I mean, that happens in aviation for sure. But if you think about it, that happens to one pilot in a career maybe, like very improbable. We're talking, if I'm reviewing the ASAP reports for half of my airline. So we're talking 1 million departures a year. And then people in my role, we divide them up by the airplane type. So I would be responsible, one of a certain number of people, for looking at half of those flights, right? Of those flights, we've got published all of our percentages, but a certain percentage are going to fill out ASAP reports. A certain percentage of those are going to be very significant events. Some really, really tiny number are going to be situations where lots of bad things were happening all at once. So the average pilot's not going to see that in their career. That's really, really rare. Whereas the average paramedic is at some point going to see somebody dying of lots of problems at the same time, I assume. I don't know. So maybe that is a big difference between our worlds.
Yes, and I think that these aids, back to keep it at the topic relevant at hand, like these aids still help,
Yeah,
And
that's
I
true.
think maybe the analogy might be like when you're faced with that problem, that's where it comes back to your fundamental, perhaps like I'm going to assume like ground school stuff where like you have to just know how the aircraft works. So like when shit's going super chaotic, you can start to problem solve a little bit and think like, well, these systems are affected and this is what's happened, and like, I don't know, does that ring true maybe?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I just think it's very rare, but you do, and you do still need the checklists. I mean, if you don't have them and you just start flipping switches, it's not going to end well. But like you said, you need the fundamental knowledge of the system to say what's important, what should I do first, which checklist should I look at, what should I do this to completion, or is something else now more important? And historically, when you look at the big aviation disasters or the stuff that makes the news, there's certainly examples of that. They're just rare. But if you were looking at, say, there was an A380 that threw some fan blades into other parts of the airplane. So now you've got multiple failures. They had a whole list of problems on their display that they had to sort of troubleshoot and triage through before they could land. That would be an example that's probably sort of like your gunshot wound example. And yeah, you still absolutely need to be referencing checklists in that case. You just may need to be saying which ones are important, which ones aren't. And at some point saying like, okay, I'm done with the checklist because we're almost at the runway. We just need to land.
So like talk me through, maybe a good example might be like Sullenberger landing on the Hudson. He was faced with something that didn't meet the checklist. Am I correct? Like how did that play out and how does it factor into our conversation?
Yeah. So if you were to look through any of these airliners' checklists, there will be their abnormal checklist. There will be a ditching checklist, right? So that would have applied to them in that case. There will be a dual engine failure checklist that would have applied in that case. But when you're talking about losing both engines at the altitude they were on the ground before they would have been able to read all those checklists, but they did a lot of what they needed to do, and they did what they could have done in the time they had available. They made a couple of errors, which were just very understandable human errors in the checklist, but it was all so time compressed. I think they performed admirably. No pilot would really look at what they did and say, oh man, I could have done that better. I certainly don't think I could have.
Is there any incident that you've had in your career that kind of keeps you honest or humble, where it was like you were kind of surprised by the circumstances or humbled by something that had happened to you, and it highlighted all of the needs for these human factor tools?
I think any pilot who's been doing it a while would have a number of them, but I definitely can think of a couple mistakes I've made over the years that were very humbling. One of them, I was doing a maintenance test flight of an airplane where we had shattered a windshield. So they installed a new windshield. 2 days, the plane was delayed. Finally, all the glue dried. So we're supposed to take off and make sure the airplane pressurizes correctly. So we were kind of out of our normal habits because we weren't pushing off of a gate, and we use things called triggers. So there's certain events that happen that are supposed to trigger the next part of the process for us cognitively. So if the flight attendant reaches through the door and says, cabin's ready for pushback, and then closes the door, that's a trigger for us to move on to the next part of the process, to start the next part of our flow, to run the next checklist. So those things were all sort of out of place. And I just didn't have good checklist discipline, and I did not configure the pneumatics panel correctly. So next thing we know, we're testing out to make sure the airplane's going to pressurize correctly, and it wasn't pressurizing at all. And we found out by getting to 10,000 feet and getting a ding 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 cabin. And fortunately, we looked up and I realized I screwed up and fixed it before all the masks drop in the back, which would have been a big pain in the butt, and I would have, I would have been very sheepish. So yeah, that's one where I look at it, I'm like, wow, I knew that we were doing things out of order and abnormally, and I knew that I should have slowed down and been careful, and I thought I was, and I still screwed it up. But I think any pilot who's been doing it a while will have several of those examples where they got humbled.
We've talked about different types of checklists. We've talked about their importance and their need. We've talked about references for people that maybe want to create one. If we kind of go one layer below this, talk to me a little bit about some of the human factors you're passionate about that drive you to do this work, and why are we doing this in the first place?
Yeah, I guess I really find it fascinating how well-intentioned professionals with a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, people who don't want to make a mistake because there's a lot at stake, and they make big mistakes. And how that happens, I find fascinating. I think studying some of the ways we make errors and the effects of things like fatigue and distractions and stuff like that, I just find it really interesting to study and learn about. And I hope that it'll sort of inoculate me to know more. But what's fascinating is realizing that it doesn't really always, because like we're still operating, like we all just got issued this Mark I human brain that does stupid human brain stuff, and you can know all these things and still do stupid human brain stuff. I'm sure all these protections can help, but at the end of the day, like we could all be that person that does the really dumb thing that is a really bad mistake.
The reason I really wanted to talk to you about specifically checklists and cognitive aids is I think there's a space in EMS to utilize them and lean on them more during critical situations. And I think that most people that I've encountered are resistant to them, probably because they've never encountered a high functioning one. They've never encountered a checklist that is designed well.
That's actually a really good point too, because I referenced my friend who was an ER doctor before, who he had a hatred of checklists, and he was a friend of mine through glider flying. And I think he probably had a somewhat reasonable disdain for checklists, because there were scenarios where they just didn't make a lot of sense, where, for example, in that world, maybe flows do make a lot more sense. And then ultimately you do want to have a very short checklist just to make sure things like gear, is done and stuff like that. But maybe that's where it came from, was between emergency medicine and his general aviation flying. He just hadn't encountered a really good checklist. But I think if you spend a lot of time with good checklists, you kind of come to swear by them. At least I do, but I'm a nerd, and I do things, even around the house that involve checklists, or also some of these other human factor protections that, you realize you need them because you make expensive or stupid mistakes.
Hey man, since the last time we talked, so my truck is parked in the garage and it has a camper shell. So it's got a glass window on the back that folds open. And since you and I talked, what I did is I got a red remove before flight tag. And when that glass is open, I put the tag around my steering wheel. Because if I were to get in the truck and just try to back out of the garage with the glass open, I would rip it off. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to make Glenn Fisher proud.
I love it. That's awesome. I just went to visit my dad, who they had a carport, and they finally finished it off by putting glass garage doors on it, and he's backed into the glass garage doors twice now. So I sat with him in the garage for a while, and we were like just brainstorming human factors, threat and error management solutions to, like, how do we not do another very expensive reverse through a glass panel thing. So I taught him some of my tricks, and like we tried to think of some habit he could set up, something, really good. It was it's a fun exercise.
Yeah. In closing, one layer deeper. So if somebody works somewhere where maybe they don't have a cognitive aid that's provided to them, what are some human factors tricks they can implement to help themselves?
Making sure that your habits are really strong, like really ingrained, that you do them kind of religiously every time if it's something that you're supposed to check, so that it'll be there to protect you when you need it, like when you're, tired or brain fart or whatever. Yeah, so that's one. Just make sure that your habits are really, really strong. Another would be, I just went to Japan, and I had read about this a long time ago because of the human factors stuff, but it was really cool to see it in person finally. So the Japanese train system, they're really big on this pointing process. So if you watch the conductors and the engineers when they are coming into a station or leaving a station, when they're setting up their train, they're doing a lot of like physically pointing at things. And it's part of their process to make sure that their brain is engaged and they're not just going to sort of do what we call like looking without seeing. So we're supposed to do that in the cockpit as well. Some pilots are more disciplined about it than others. But if you're going to look at something, be very intentional about it. So if I need to check this gauge and make sure it's within a certain value, or that, my landing gear's down and I have 3 green or something like that, just be very intentional. Use more of your body and you will be more intentional. So like touch it or point at it or say it, something like that. That can all really force you to like slow down and actually process what you're looking at, and so that you don't just, cursory like read and this is even true if you have a checklist, like landing gear down 3 green, and there's cases where both pilots said it, presumably, cases where even one of the pilots or both the pilots looked at it and then just didn't process it fully. So pointing, touching, all those things can help. I've got climbing friends that give me a lot of grief because when we're climbing, I do a lot of touching. We're setting up a belay system or whatever. I want to put my hand on the carabiner and try to open it to see that it's locked. I can see that it's locked, but I just want that habit to be like, touch it, try to, it's one more way to engage my brain to make sure that it's actually done. Because, me and friends, and I've made this mistake as they have, like misloading a gree. I don't know if if you got climbers in the audience here, one of the belay devices, you can put the rope in the wrong direction and all of a sudden the thing doesn't do what it's supposed to do. And me, as well as all of my friends, have loaded them incorrectly, and then another person's detected it. But you're more likely to detect it if you like really intentionally point at it, look at it, hold it, something like that.
Yeah. One thing I do, so the stretcher in the helicopter I work in, it slides into a track on the floor of the aircraft, and then there's a little latch, and the latch flips up to keep it secured in the track. Well, when you're loading that aircraft with the engines and rotor running, you can't hear and you can't feel as well. So one of the things is the latch goes from a horizontal position to a vertical position. And so what I always do is when I flip it up to its vertical position, I slap it back and forth. Not hard, but just a little bit. And then it doesn't move, right? If it wasn't latched properly, it would fall back down, and then the stretcher could potentially just slide right out.
Yeah.
And so that's an example of what you're talking about.
Definitely. And it's funny because people that don't operate in these sort of environments and have those sort of habits, to them, some of these behaviors look weird, almost OCD. But they're very effective and protective to try to prevent these bad outcomes.
Well, Glenn, it's a pleasure, man. You're a wealth of knowledge in this area. I know to you, this stuff probably feels very routine and normal. You talk about it all the time. It's the water you swim in all the time. But I promise, to our world in EMS, this is not all normal. And so I think hearing just your experience and your wisdom in these things gives us all stuff to think about in terms of personal things we can do, human factors, things we can implement on our next call to help us prevent error, and then all the way up to if we are in a position to design, create, and implement a checklist, what would be a good one. So I really appreciate it, and thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you. And I think also, like people like you are very probably valuable in your world because you have a foot in both places, whereas people like me don't. So I think probably in your world, people who are responsible for making checklists should look to the people who've done a little bit of aviation, et cetera, and use them to make checklists that are a little bit more effective.
Well, I appreciate that. I think the thing that's most eye-opening for me working in helicopter EMS, where you do have a foot in both worlds, is coming from 911 EMS, where people kind of balk at checklists, or they say, oh, I can memorize that. They rely more heavily on rote memorization. And then to interact with a pilot flying in a single pilot configuration, which means it's all on them. And they just have no ego about, yeah, I follow the checklist. Like, that's just what I do. Like
Yeah.
the way that aviation has done such a good job of just from day one, I would imagine, as a pilot, you're just trained to like take the ego out of this, because if you screw this up, you're gonna die.
Yeah, and I mean, those guys are doing the coolest, in my opinion, craziest kind of aviation there is. I mean, single pilot, helicopter flying, landing in places that are not, an improved landing site on a site of a car crash or something. Like that has got to be some of the most complicated and interesting sort of aviating there is. So yeah, if they don't have an ego and they're using the checklists, then everybody else should probably take the cue.
Well, I won't speak for them because I don't do what they do. But yeah, it's a risk and it's a level of responsibility that I think they're very aware of, and everyone on the crew is aware of. And I'm thankful that we talk about it frequently, because they screw up and we all crater into the ground. So
Right.
I think there's a lot of great lessons that can be taken from aviation, helicopter EMS, and applied to all aspects of EMS.
That makes sense.
Well, cool. Well, thanks, Glenn. Thanks for your
Thank you.
time. Really appreciate you, man.
Yeah, this was fun.